Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here today with Nick Bagley. Nick, first, did I say your name right? Is it
You
Nick
got it
Bagley?
perfect. Yep.
Okay, great. And can you just give the audience a little bit of your background? Who are you? What do you do?
Sure. I am a law professor at the University of Michigan Law School. I've done that since 2010. I worked before that at the Justice Department, and I spent last year serving as Chief Counsel to Governor Whitmer, and a couple of years before that, serving as Special Counsel on her COVID response.
Uh-huh. And what years were you in the Justice Department? And what was your job there?
2007 to 2010, I was a line attorney. I was on the appellate staff in the civil division, so defending government from people who wanted to sue it over kind of whatever you might imagine.
Yeah. Okay. And so yeah, we're here to talk about your article, your law review article, the Procedure Fetish. And I read this article, and basically, if you're going to summarize it, you can summarize it in a sentence or two. My understanding is basically government wants to do good things, and there's too much preventing government from doing these things, and basically we need to stop that. So could you just sort of expand on that a little bit and say how you sort of think about it, administrative law and the role of government?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I thought of the paper was really more of a polemic directed at the political left than at the political right, although I've shifted a little bit over time. I think if you are located on the political right, do you think government is apt to screw things up and you are suspicious of pointy headed bureaucrats and their ability to interfere in private ordering? I think the desire to layer procedure on procedure to effectively emasculate government or make it very difficult to act makes some sense. Again, I'm not as convinced of that as I was even just 5 years ago, but I understand the impulse. But on the political left, what I find and have found distressing is sort of an unreflective embrace of procedural rules that are all designed to achieve good ends, to keep agencies within legal bounds and to make sure they're taking concerns like costs and benefits and equity and public accountability and all the rest into account. But the end of the day, too many of our agencies are simply, hemmed in by too many rules to effectively do their jobs. And so this paper was an effort to try to explore why it is that lawyers in particular and the left in particular have become enamored of this procedurally oriented approach to governance, which is actually, it's not confined to the United States, but we are an unusually staunch adherent to that kind of legalism in terms of international comparisons. So that's what the paper was attempting to explore.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think we should probably, I mean, some people are going to have law background and some people are not. So I think for people who don't, it's probably just worth sort of spelling out. You're talking about administrative law, right? You're not talking about barriers for Congress or the Supreme Court or something doing what they want. So basically, the way our system works is you have Congress, it passes laws, it creates these government agencies, right? And these government agencies will have a broad mission, right? And then they'll have a lot of discretion in how they do that mission. And then the administrative agencies are restricted by a bunch of rules. You have to do X, Y, Z before you go ahead with that mission. And basically, this is the subset of the government that we're talking about. The rules are basically getting in the way of the administrative agencies, basically trying to improve people's lives. Is that right?
That's the basic picture. I'll complicate it only by saying that a lot of the procedural rules that hem agencies in do come from Congress. And a lot of the kind of administrative, the administrative legal apparatus that's been created over time has been responsive to congressional desires. So there's it's not just a way of focusing on the way that agencies circumscribe their own authority, but the way that we collectively, through the legislature, have circumscribed agencies' power.
Right. And there's been a lot of judicial interpretation here too, right? There was
a ton. Yeah.
That was and that's a recent development, is it not? That was like
I mean, I think one of the ways you can chart the history here is to look back at the adoption of the Administrative Procedure Act back in the immediate post-war era, so 1946. The APA is adopted, and this is like the Bible for administrative law. It's sort of the backbone of federal administrative review and oversight, and it basically says, look, agencies, you're going to get a lot of room to operate, but when you behave in certain ways, you've got to abide by certain rules. And at the end of the day, some of your actions are going to be subject to judicial review. Courts are going to get a chance to come in. And over time, the pretty spare language of the Administrative Procedure Act, it doesn't actually hem agencies in all that much, was interpreted by the courts to impose greater and greater procedural burdens. And this really took off in the 1970s and 80s and is continuing even today. And it's really a legacy, I think, of a kind of skepticism about the role of government power that arose in the early 1970s. And this skepticism drew on lots of different strains, but you can point to the civil rights movement as being a big place where people said, wait a minute, maybe government shouldn't just be left to its own devices. Look what all these states in the South are doing. It was a response to a feeling that government was in the pocket of big business, that it was not responsive to public needs when it came to things like public safety. So Ralph Nader made his name, railing against the lack of safety features in automobiles, and that kind of kicked off a consumer rights movement. You kind of put and the rise, of course, of the environmental movement is another part of this kind of 1970s skepticism that made people think, wait a minute, maybe the answer here is not giving agencies a lot of discretion. Maybe the answer here is to use outside levers of authority to make sure that agencies stay in line. They do what we want them to do. And, while I think it's understandable why progressives of the time chose that approach, I think it has led to an accretion of procedures that now make government dysfunctional in very deep ways, ways that I think are bad on both the left and the right, that basically make it very difficult for government to accomplish the collective ends that we've set for it.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So there's ways to approach, this discussion. I heard you on Ezra Klein, and it's interesting to sort of hear this, as a debate, like sort of between two liberals talking about, how to get government working better. From a broader perspective, you must have opinions about why, government can be trusted with this power. And so let me just ask you, what's wrong with the basic conservative libertarian position that the incentives are wrong, they have limited information, government agencies are going to do stupid things, and it's probably better to just, limit their power to the greatest extent possible if we can.
Yeah, I think I'll accept all of that until I'll jump off just at the last station, which is that, of course, bureaucrats have limited information. Of course, they can make dunderheaded decisions. But by the same token, there are all sorts of good reasons for thinking that government regulation is essential and will inure to the benefit of the public. I think the cleanest examples of this come in the context of externalities. So if you're thinking about a factory, a power plant, or a manufacturing facility that is belching out pollutants that end up harming us all collectively, well, they're not going to take the costs of that pollution into account unless they're forced to. So, it's a classic rationale for government intervention. It's one that I think is pretty unimpeachable. And the question then becomes, okay, can we trust the agencies that we've given the authority to regulate to do so effectively? And there, I think the proof is in the pudding. The Clean Air Act was adopted in the readopted in the 1970s and has had enormous positive and beneficial effects on air quality nationwide. We see in the developing world where those controls aren't in place, terrible air pollution that is killing millions of people every year. I think it's hard to look back on that and think that regulation is at the root of all that ails us. That's not to deny that regulation can be excessive and that you can have a kind of reflex for stupid regulation. I think it's easy to point to occupational licensure, for example, as being a set of regulations that are very difficult to defend in many cases. The last thing I'll say about all this is that I think there's a temptation on the right to blame a lot of the problems on the existence of agencies that have discretion. But many of the most, ridiculous things that agencies do are directed by legislatures themselves. These aren't exercises of discretion. They are statutory mandates handed down. The other thing I'll say is the demand for government regulation, whenever it comes to safety standards or controlling externalities or regulating the marketplace, the demand exists, and for, I think, some very good reasons. And I think the libertarian response unsettles me a little bit because it seems like you want to sometimes deny the demand and enfeeble the tool that will be reached for. And to my mind, what I think is probably a more sensible approach, and one that I think can speak across political lines, is look, we have a demand. We've got some things that the government is that people are going to clamor for. Let's make sure that we've got government agencies that are effective, nimble, that can think carefully, that can help us to make sure that we're not, tied down as private industry with a bunch of stupid rules that don't serve our interests well. I said it was the last thing, but I'll add one thing more, which is I think the way that government regulations tend to go awry when you have agencies that are unable to achieve their missions, it's by locking in the current status quo. What you end up doing is have a bunch of regulations that incumbents can negotiate pretty effectively, but it makes it very difficult for plucky startups to come in and actually, get off the ground. And you see that kind of an effort on the part of incumbents to use regulations to their own advantage. And I think if you want agencies that can stand up to that kind of pressure, I don't think you want weakened, procedurally emaciated agencies. You want agencies that are empowered to actually take the public interest more broadly into account. So I think that's the picture as I see it.
Yeah, you have some interesting you have some interesting ideas in your paper along those lines. I think you wrote about the fact that you have this, for example, notice and comment procedure. So under the APA, the agencies have to go out and they have to say we're going to maybe institute this rule, and then basically people can send them comments. And who ends up sending them the comments? Well, it's a huge portion of them are major corporations. Now, from the libertarian perspective, you might say, okay, they're just they're just warding off this regulation that's just going to be stupid. And the other perspective is they're being captured or they're being influenced. And yeah, you're right. I mean, there's not it's not completely obvious that it's always going to be the case that government is just warding off bad regulations, because government is also, private businesses are probably in many cases also going to want to get advantages and lock those advantages in. So that makes sense. The EPA is an interesting one because I think that's like regulating pollutants in the air. I think that's probably like the classic textbook case of justified government interference. I don't think you'd find, many libertarians or conservatives who agree with that in theory. It's sort of funny that the EPA ends up like one of the most unpopular agencies, at least on the right. I mean, they're always complaining about the EPA, but it seems like the EPA in theory should be one of those things that you think would exist. And I think you're right. I think it's good to think about these things as far as, empirical data on what's happened over the decades. There's other areas of, American, and maybe you'll give me your thoughts on this, of American life where, the returns aren't as obvious. So Department of Education, government spending goes up. It's hard to see, the results there, the test scores, correlation with the government spending. OSHA, I know there's been decrease in, workplace fatalities, but a lot of these things, you look at the trend lines before, the 1960s, the 1970s, the rise of the welfare, the regulatory state. These things were going down at the same pace or at a larger pace before. So, you think maybe this is just, people are getting wealthier and they're less willing to take risks and the market is taking care of that. So do you see that? Do you think in terms of like, there's policy areas where clearly regulation has been good and then some where it has been bad? Do you see that similarly, or do you sort of see, how broadly applicable do you see your theory across different policy domains, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's very difficult to paint with a broad brush because government is extraordinarily complicated because our economy is really complicated. And, so I of course take the point that there are lots of areas where government intrusion has either been kind of a swing and a miss or even counterproductive. And in those areas, I don't think there's any reason to hold on to a failed experiment. And of course, we'll have to debate which are in fact failed experiments. And that's going to be informed by data and by, close attention to that particular regulatory domain. So it is hard for me to paint with a broad brush. What I can say is that at least at the federal level, major regulations go through a centralized review process where part of what the little agency called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB, part of what they do is tally up the costs and benefits of the major rules that are adopted every year. And these costs and benefits are, they're agency economists trying to crunch the numbers. This is not a process where it's, you're told to get a particular answer and then they go and, massage the numbers to get that particular answer. But it looks like over time, the regulations that are imposed in the big ticket regulations end up having societal benefits that exceed their costs. That's consistent with there being a lot of needless regulations out there. But I think it does not support the blunderbuss kind of let's just, torch the whole thing and not, we don't really believe in government. If I have a message for, folks who see the world a little more differently than I do, I think it's that it's just much more complicated than you might think. And there are lots of domains where some measure of government intervention will make things better. And, I wish it was as simple as saying I have a general attitude or orientation toward the state and that'll just give me my answers. I just don't think the world is that simple.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at, and when you look at sort of the universe of things that government could potentially be doing, there's some things that do look like, low-hanging fruit. There's some, particle in the atmosphere and, it costs like $200,000 per life saved. And, that's like so obvious. You should just regulate that thing. And then there's some stuff that just looks like, sort of popular sort of hysteria, like vaping. I don't know if there was ever any evidence that, vaping was a big deal, but, became a big news story for a while.
Mm-hmm.
The cost benefit analysis is, interesting. I think that's probably the most convincing case to somebody who's going to be a conservative or libertarian. Like somebody's, I don't always, sometimes the data is not, sometimes social science you could be skeptical of, but yeah, there is a way to do cost benefit analysis that gets you in the right universe of sort of whether this is good or bad. But you actually think that the cost benefit, and we do too much of that, right? You think sort of no, are you shaking your head?
I'm shaking my head. Podcast listeners can't see that, but no, I don't think I wouldn't say we do too much cost benefit analysis. I think that cost benefit analysis is actually an invaluable tool for thinking through how to select stringency of standards, for example. And I think without it, it's very difficult even to know where you start. The criticism I have of the way we do cost benefit analysis is institutional. So this little office called OIRA that I mentioned earlier was key in getting agencies across the administrative state to start doing and to do more rigorously cost-benefit analysis. And they now today review, kind of check the homework of all of the federal agencies that engage in CBA. The problem with that isn't so much that there is a lot of cost-benefit analysis happening or that OIRA is helping to standardize processes across the administrative state. It's that OIRA is a tiny little office that serves as a bottleneck to regulations and kind of place where even under a Democratic administration, regulations, good regulations, can go to die. And that's the concern I have. And it's not even so much that there is a bottleneck there, and that's the horror of that. It's that it is one more bottleneck in a string of bottlenecks that includes judicial review, includes the extraordinary rigors of the notice and comment process, includes endless public feedback, and fill in the blank. That makes it extremely difficult to do anything of any consequence. And again, I worry about that not because I'm a fan of regulation in the abstract, and I'm just happy to see it go through, but because I think we can save lives if we do that. And because I think moving us forward is going to, when it comes to some of the biggest challenges of the 21st century, is going to require government to be pretty nimble and pretty involved. And if at every stage we say, nope, you got to go through this rigorous 17-point process, I don't think we're going to get where we need to go. The biggest example here for me, and the thing that keeps me up at night, is the move to renewables. I think there's a kind of hand-wavy assumption on the left that if we throw money at the problem, somehow all these solar farms are going to be sited and these wind farms are going to be installed, and we won't ever have to see them, and we won't actually have to build them on public lands or on lands of any size or scope. And the numbers just don't support that. It's going to be a massive infrastructure investment. And we don't do that kind of thing anymore. And government is part of the reason we don't do any of that anymore. So if you care about dynamism, in the American economy, I think you have to think a lot more critically about how to empower the federal government and state government, state and local governments in particular, to be more effective and responsive.
Mm. Yeah. So you mentioned you worked on COVID policy under Governor Whitmer of Michigan. How do you that that gets me thinking? How do you think about sort of the FDA performance during COVID? In the context of your ideas, what was the problem there that they didn't have? Didn't have flexibility. Like, no, they didn't have to go through, the FDA, CDC didn't have to go through a rulemaking process during COVID. I mean, they pretty much had permission to hurry things up. From the reporting, the FDA was resistance, and it was the Trump administration to a large extent that was saying go faster on the vaccines. I think smart people looking back saying we went. It was good to go fast, and we should have probably gone faster. So, how do you think about your ideas in the context of just FDA and sort of what happened there?
Yeah, I think the record at FDA is a mixed bag. I think there's no doubt about it. They did have quite broad authority under the emergency use authorization to move quickly on therapeutics and vaccines. And by historical standards, they moved very quickly on both. By standards of a pandemic that was killing people by the day, every moment matters. And there were moments in that process that could have been shortened, that could have been tightened, and should have been. I think the biggest mistake, the one that I look back on, and I was just tearing my hair out at the time, I wasn't serving for the governor at that moment, but was when the efficacy data on the vaccines came out, it was quite clear that a first dose provided substantial protection from COVID. And the moment you saw the chart showing that, you should have thought, okay, first dose is first, get it to in as many arms as we can quickly. And FDA failed to do that. And they also spent a ton of time, and not just them, but these are advisory groups that advise both FDA and CDC, a ton of time wringing their hands over very complicated equity dispersion rules that were much too complicated to actually effectuate on short notice, and that assured that some very high-risk people were not getting the vaccine quickly. And there was a very easy way to draw, to create a line, which is by age. I mean, this disease is extraordinarily age-specific in its death rates. So, there's a lot more to say about FDA, and people who are more familiar with FDA can and have said it. I highly recommend Scott Gottlieb's book on this. He is, extraordinary at thinking through the challenges. I think he's maybe gentler on FDA than he should have been. But nonetheless, I think overall, you can't look back and think our government functioned as appropriately as it should have during the COVID pandemic, and FDA was part of that.
Yeah, and when I look, at it, it's not just what did they do and what did they not do. Sort of, what signal am I getting about the kind of people who populate, FDA and CDC? You talked about the age thing. I mean, the fact that a lot of these mask recommendations, for kids. I mean, you talked about the age thing. It's just the kids' risk was so low from the beginning, and then them not jumping up and down and saying we have to move on the vaccines. I mean, things like human challenge trials. I mean, never, as far as I know, never even seriously considered. But a lot of people can look at that and say, look, these people are, and maybe this is just FDA, maybe this is just whoever happened to be in charge at the time. They're overly cautious. They don't do cost benefit well. So why should we trust them with more discretion? What's stopping someone from taking that lesson from it?
Yeah, I mean, I take something close to the opposite lesson from it, which is it's true. FDA underperformed, and there was a kind of reactive bureaucratic instinct that took over at a time when we really needed to move fast and make the best choice we had under conditions of high uncertainty. I think that the way you get an agency to function better is by bringing in better people, by making it a highly sought after job, by making it a highly prestigious job, by paying better, by making sure that the folk who are there have the backbone, the right incentives to make tough calls that might make political minders, might make more conventionally bureaucratic types very nervous. The risk, of course, is that you're just going to, pay more for the same stodgy bureaucrats. And certainly there's some risk of that. But if you really care about a dynamic agency, the answer of simply railing on the FDA, I'm not sure that that's an effective response. Another way of thinking about it is the libertarian response seems to anticipate that the desired end state is the elimination of the FDA or its radical minimization. And I think that's I think that just is a manifestation of a kind of utopian fallacy. It'd be nice to get there from here, but I don't think we're going to go back to a time of patent medicine where we aren't going to insist on high quality clinical trials before we allow drugs to be sold. And if that's the case, we should be all collectively thinking, how do we make this agency work better so it doesn't do dumb things and does very smart things? And I want to have that conversation, and there's not a lot of political room to have that conversation.
Yeah, and so you touched on sort of the personnel issue. There was a executive order near the end of the Trump administration. I think it was 13957 that would have basically made it easier for the president to fire large numbers of people within the federal government. It was repealed, I think, upon Biden right away upon Biden coming into office. What did you think of that at the time? I mean, what do you think about reforms like that? Just putting it more under political control, and that seems like it would take care of some of these goals, right? It would probably move.
Yeah, I think civil service reform is a hard case for me because I think there is a lot to be said for the kind of nimbleness in hiring and firing that you see, and you can see in the private sector, and obviously you don't see as much of in government. I will say that our experience with the spoils system and with highly partisan hiring and firing in government is not inspiring and suggests that the pathologies there may well be worth guarding against, even if it creates some creakiness in bureaucracy. I can say, like I said, I think this is a hard case for me. I don't have very strong priors, except to note that we adopted civil service reform for very good reason, and we ought to be cautious about getting rid of something that has more or less served us well over time. We had civil service reform in place at the beginning of, in the front half of the 20th century when we really did do big things. So I don't know that it's an essential component of clearing away some of the underbrush when it comes to procedural rules.
Yeah. What do you think about the way we select federal employees in the first place? The civil service exam, that was sort of a casualty of civil rights law. There was a settlement between the Justice Department and I think the Civil Service Commission, where they were worried about disparate impact on the civil service exam, and they basically have been looking for new ways to hire ever since. And they've gotten rid of that. Do you think we need? Do you think we've gone too far? You talked about these sort of equity concerns getting in the way of effective government. Do you see that as one of these cases?
I'm not familiar enough with it to be able to comment intelligently. I think I'd want to ask about the alternatives that are in the offing, and in a highly unequal society, there will be some disparate impact from any neutral tool that you adopt. And if you therefore discard the tool and consistently overlook qualified people, I do have some concerns. But again, I don't know that that's the alternative. It depends very much on what you replace the test with.
Mm-hmm. And you would probably be in favor of, I'm guessing, higher pay. Easier to fire. If it's not political control, how would you design this? Have you thought about this or looked at other countries and seen ones that do this particularly well? I mean, it can't be that, I did see one piece of data that said that basically, I don't remember how exactly they measured, but basically federal employees had the most secure job, of any sector you could look at, right? And that's believable, right? I mean, it's
not except professors.
Yeah, except for tenured professors, right? Depends on if you've met that hurdle, right?
Of course.
So because do you think about sort of because it's not as easy as the private sector because you have, objective metrics. Are you selling something or making a profit or not? So how does it work in government? Do you just, is this another form of discretion you just give to the agencies and say, we're going to get smart professional people and let them sort of run it the way they see best?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fallacy to think that every organization has metrics they can point to for every one of their employees and say you hit that or didn't in a kind of mechanical, quantitative way. There are all sorts of ways of measuring performance, and some of them are soft and qualitative. And there are a lot of places in the private sector where low performing people kind of hang on for extended periods as well. So it's not like it's a an idyll over there. Um, but yeah, I mean, like the bottom line is that we are so afraid of the exercise of discretion at so many of our agencies that we have handcuffed them in ways that end up being counterproductive. And to the extent that what you want is an entity that can make those qualitative judgments and act on them. I want to hire X person because they're great and we're going to have to pay a little more, but it's going to be worth it. And as a manager of this organization, I am trusted to make that call. I think there's a lot to be said for that. Does that mean there are going to be some abuse of that discretion? Sure. I mean, discretion is always abused in private and public institutions all the time. But it doesn't follow that the answer is to try to squeeze discretion out by creating a bunch of rules that actually, like don't make the entity serve the purposes that we set for it.
Yeah. So what are some of the sort of are there low hanging fruits sort of here that you think government should be doing that it can't because of the restrictions placed on it? What gets you excited about if you could if you could basically streamline agency action? Like, well, what do you think would be the best things that government could be doing right now?
So one of the places that came up quite a bit in my working for the governor is permitting, right? So you have an entity that wants to open a plant and they've got to get 17 different sets of permits from 12 different agencies, none of whom work well with one another, all of whom are on different IT systems. Somebody has a database that they're, like using on it. It's basically an old Excel spreadsheet. Somebody else over here has 21st century technology, and they've all got to get on the same page, all on a relatively short order in order to get this project over the finish line. There's a lot of efficiencies to be gained by simply taking a step back and coordinating across agencies and creating various accountability systems. So you say, 60 days out, we're going to have all of these done, being clear with the public about what they're going to do on the permitting side. Another place where I think there's a lot of room for reforms on the procurement side. One of the big challenges that every level of government is facing right now is with IT and with making sure that you are getting high quality vendors to provide you products that actually serve, members of the public who need to interact with them. And sometimes our procurement rules are so clumsy or poorly designed that we have to either include lots and lots of strictures in the opening contracts that end up handcuffing you down the line, or end up just taking forever and costing way more than we should be paying for that kind of information technology. So those are two easy ones. Another one that I care a lot about is judicial review. It is considered to be de rigueur for any agency action of any kind of moment. And the prevailing assumption seems to be that if the courts have not given their blessing, there's something, concerning about what it is agencies are doing. And I see no reason to believe that that's the case. And I don't think that courts are especially effective at overseeing agencies or especially humble about their epistemic limitations. And I would much prefer it, or fully cognizant of the consequences of their decisions. They seem to think, oh, well, I'm just telling them they can't do this agency action, but they can go back and just do it again. But of course, that takes years and years. The political window may have closed. It may be the case that the next panel also thinks that the replacement action is going to be invalid. It ends up creating a very difficult to navigate bottleneck that kills projects, that kills regulations, that kills moving forward. And, I think if we could wave one magic wand, it would be to tell the courts to back off.
Would you just have, what would you, I mean, Could we maybe get into a little bit of the weeds? What kind of court decisions, or what kind of posture you'd like the courts to take? Is it a standing issue? What's the worst what's the worst sort of thing here that the courts are doing?
Yeah. So the place where I think it's most obviously a problem under the APA, you can challenge an agency action if it's and the courts will strike it down if it is arbitrary or capricious. That's the phrase from the APA. And originally, when the APA was adopted, Congress meant by arbitrary and capricious. Look, is this so crazy that you can't even understand how the agency action could solve the problem they're intending to solve? It's a really deferential standard, one that is almost never satisfied because we need to be able to trust that agencies have some room to do their work. Over time, the courts have transformed the arbitrary or capricious language into a roving license to strike down any agency action they deem to be unreasonable. And in a highly divided, in a divided country, you see courts, often courts with a political axe to grind, on both the left and the right, striking down regulations or actions from the opposing political party, and often doing so in quite sweeping ways. And doing so not because the agency action is illegal, but because they think it doesn't meet their standard of reasonableness. They didn't consider enough alternatives. They didn't cross their T's and dot their I's. They didn't respond to this particular comment that came in. I think that kind of, they call it hard look review. I think that's extraordinarily pernicious because it gives a bunch of generalist judges who don't know a thing about the regulatory domain a ton of latitude to interfere. And I think in practice, it's quite pernicious. So that's one thing that's easy, I think, to either water down or simply eliminate. But I'll tell you that in my world of administrative law, that suggestion would be taken as anathema. Like, how could you possibly even contemplate it? And I think we'd be much better off if we did.
Yeah. Do you think that part of it, it's like it was sort of making this case and making the idea that government needs to be given more discretion to act in the common good, to make this sort of more sellable to the public? You brought up these equity concerns and these other kind of concerns, and it seems like a lot of the opposition to what government is doing tends to be opposed to this stuff, in the sense that there's often these values that certain people have, people on the left have, that people on the right don't particularly don't agree with. Would it be sort of would it be perhaps easier to sell sort of a more sort of active administrative state if it's sort of just tried to do the cost and benefits and not maybe get into these more contentious kind of political questions, these moral ideas that people don't always agree with?
Maybe. I mean, I guess I take your question to be that there are ends to which the regulatory apparatus is put that don't command widespread support. And maybe what you should do is confine your activity to things where you can sort of bring a broader coalition together. Look, I think there's always wisdom in asking, is the game worth the candle? Is this intervention going to really move the needle, and will it be politically stable both in the medium and the long term? And if you're spending a lot of time tilting at windmills, or a lot of time building up a policy that's just going to be ripped down the next time a Republican president takes over, I don't think you can look back on that and feel terribly proud about what you did. And surely there are efforts like that occur from time to time because you're trying to satisfy some part of your base or whatever else. And happens on, again, both the left and the right. I don't think this is confined to the left. That said, I think that the other implicit, sort of suggestion in your question, which you can tell me if you didn't mean to suggest it, is that if only Democrats would jettison their most outlandish ideas, we'd be okay with, like everybody would put down their weapons when it came to environmental regulations that clearly have more benefits than costs, or safety regulations that we can demonstrate actually will save lives. I don't believe that for a moment. I think a lot of what motivates not the intellectual right so much as the traditional conservative right is simply a distaste for regulation. And I think there's a risk of sounding like you're concern trolling a little bit, like, oh, like we'd be on board if you guys would just knock it off with those woke regulations. And I just think I think that the roots of the opposition to the regulatory state are much, much deeper.
Yeah. I mean, there might be a split here between conservative intellectuals and maybe conservative politicians or conservative media. I mean, if you read conservative media, if you read conservative Twitter, it's all about the woke stuff. I mean, the woke stuff could be 0.1% of some government program, and they'll focus on it more than anything else. So it does seem plausible to me that at least in the political realm, you could probably have at least a temper opposition to this stuff.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical. I'm old enough to remember when we were all pre-woke and there was still a lot of fighting. So I think you may want to, like, I worry a little bit that the woke is just a new way of getting leverage for an attack. Now, don't get me wrong. Like, I understand that does motivate lots of people, and certainly woke excesses, they hit a lot of people where they live. I don't mean to diminish that. I just think that were you to eliminate it altogether, we'd be right back to the same place that we're at.
Yeah, you may be right. I mean, this reminds me of one piece of your paper. I think you said that the regulatory state. You said government bureaucrats were actually quite representative of the public. I think compared to politicians or judges. And you looked at maybe like race and maybe a few other things. And I was reading that. And I said, what I said to myself, what's their partisan identification? I mean, what percentage of the federal bureaucracy is Republican? You could understand how to a conservative that might not be reassuring, right?
I think part of what this tracks, and this is a deep problem, is the way that our political parties are getting sorted along educational lines and educational attainment. And I think my preference is to empower our agencies, make sure they are adequately staffed with people who have real expertise in particular domains, and that implies that they will be drawn from folks who have strong educational backgrounds. And that I can understand why, if we are getting polarized along educational lines, that may not be especially reassuring. I will say, sometimes I'm a little bit, I think that the partisan affiliation numbers, which, just for listeners out there, it's absolutely true that the vast majority of folk who work in both federal and to a lesser extent state governments are, identify as liberal. They identify as Democrats. Within institutions, most of the incentives run to achieving your principal's goals, right? That's how you advance in the institution. That's how you understand your role, right? Like, folks who are bureaucrats genuinely do understand their role to be to carry out the instructions of their superiors. And so the angst when, Trump was elected was not the angst of it was not like, oh, I want to burrow in and fight every tooth and claw. The angst was, I'm a civil servant. I want to carry out the goals of my principal, and this particular principal may have goals that I find so anathema that this job may just be personally hard, which is just a long-winded way of saying I think you could make more of the partisan affiliation numbers than you might, because you lose sight of the way that political leadership really does determine the direction that agencies are heading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're right. There's education polarization. I mean, there's, the education polarization isn't nearly as, extreme as the numbers of the, federal employees would suggest. But of course, there's self-selection. It doesn't mean that they're, trying to keep Republicans out or anything. Is it sort of a would it perhaps be beneficial to understand? So again, let me put it this way. So when I read your stuff, it seems like a lot of sensible ideas, and then there's a lot of trying to improve people's lives in the margins. Get people cleaner water, cleaner air. Don't kill them in car accidents. All that stuff sounds great. It's there's some people, I think, for whom that works, and maybe they're attracted to federal bureaucracy. That's sort of the way the federal bureaucracy is set up to, and that's the way it's sold, to sort of bring marginal improvements to people's lives. I think some people are sort of, they can only be motivated by something like a bigger vision. I think a lot of libertarians are in this category, like, oh, privatize, space travel and the FDA, and we'll cure aging, and we'll go to Mars, and we'll all become, we'll be living as gods. Um, is there room for sort of, the federal government, or people who believe in regulation, people who believe in, a more active state, to sort of, to sort of make a case that it can appeal to those people who sort of need a bigger vision? I guess I guess one thing I might be asking is, is there a way to synthesize sort of the classic, the classical sort of, post New Deal, post Great Society, Democrat centrist liberalism with, what Tyler Cowen calls state capacity libertarianism, sort of put that together and have like a vision that can do a lot of things, including bring more maybe people, conservatives, into the federal government and all kinds of other things.
I hope so. I'm not sure that I am either the right messenger for that vision, or that I've got it fully worked out. But I do think that libertarians strike me as sometimes naive about the extent to which government is already interlaced with private action. Like, and the cliche is, well, all your goods need to go from your factory on highways. Those are government funded. Like you guys all need that. And I think it goes so much deeper than that, right? It's the highways, it's the infrastructure, it's which is to say, what about the bridges that are nearby, or the canals, or the railroads? If you need beyond the transportation side, you need the water to actually get to your plant. You need electricity to get to your plant. You need to have a workforce that's actually going to be stable. You need to make sure that the public, both at the local level and at the state level, are bought in on what you want to accomplish. You've got to make sure that you're actually able to have the workforce that lives close and actually afford housing. I think there's no world in which the government will become less sort of commingled with the private sector. And right now, government is a problem for the private sector. You see it at the state level. There's a ton of money coming through the state, all the states, through because of a couple of these major, you might think of them as industrial policy bills from the Biden administration. And that money is pushing forward some really novel investments in electric vehicles, in semiconductor plants, and states are competing ardently to try to attract them. One of the things you see as you're trying to attract these new facilities to create the opportunities for new development is a demand that, like, we need to know that your state can actually help us and won't get in our way. We need to know that when we ask for an air permit and a water permit, y'all are going to behave reasonably and do so in a timely fashion. And if we can't get that kind of assurance, we can't we can't we can't actually make the investments here that you'd like us to make. Um, so that, I think, is something like the synthesis that I'd like to see. That progressives say, we care about, like, moving forward on the status quo because we don't have enough housing. It's like we don't have enough. The costs of sclerosis here are falling most heavily on the lower rungs of the income spectrum, along racial minorities. And I want folk on the political right to say, hey, we care about a dynamic economy that can, take us to Mars and cure all that ails us and whatever else. And I think those two groups really do have a lot in common, but they're at the opposite ends of the political spectrum, and finding a way to bring them together is very hard.
Yeah. That's all interesting. Yeah, there is sort of this sort of, I mean, the synthesis that I'm sort of, that I'm bringing up, I do see like hints of it, right? I see the smartest, conservative people understand that, YIMBY is probably a good idea, that we've gone too far in restricting, housing. I see the smartest people on, the left, acknowledging that too. The FDA was another one where it's sort of, it was there was a really a smart person consensus about what the government did right and what government did wrong. I mean, to a really, really remarkable degree. And whether it's, did you read the Matt Iglesias piece in Bloomberg about the Operation Warp Speed? It was in the last month or so.
Yeah, no,
Um,
I did read it. The thesis, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but the thesis is something like, it would have been great if Trump had taken credit for this as the greatest win of his administration, which it surely was. And the turning against the vaccines is really going to it's not going to help FDA sort of pick up and think more nimbly in the future. It's actually going to encourage its least bold instincts.
Right, and it's sort of darker than that because Trump wanted to take. I mean, Trump was pro-vaccine. He wanted to take credit for it. He started to get booed at his rallies for saying the vaccine was a good thing, and sort of
Yeah.
started tiptoeing away from that. So it's actually a darker. It's like
Yeah.
actually a much darker vision where it's actually the public is not going to let it's not going to let this sort of consensus come together, which should be a consensus that this was a great thing, and we need more programs like that. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard.
I mean, it is quite remarkable to me, just to, closing on an optimistic vision. Operation Warp Speed leveraged, extraordinary amounts of public spending, a strong signal that we will be flexible with rules that have traditionally been really difficult for you to negotiate. We'll be a willing partner. We are open for business. Can you work with us? And the private sector responded. And I think that's the kind of thing that I look at and think there are opportunities here where there are so many dollar bills littering the sidewalk that we're not picking up. And I would like to start thinking harder about exactly how we can start picking them up.
Nick, have you looked at all into the Chinese system? I know China, very bad human rights abuses, all that. We all know that. But there's been some interesting things written about sort of its system of governance, and they do a lot of sort of this competition at the local level. They run experiments. They have sort of objective metrics. There's a lot that's interesting there. I mean, have you looked into this at all? And do you think there's anything to
Haven't
learn
spent a
here?
lot of time looking into it. No, I'm roughly familiar with it, and I think there's a lot of folk who look at China with a kind of I understand this impulse with a kind of I wish we could manage that, right? An old friend of mine was went to Shanghai, I think, and was riding around on new bike paths that had been installed between the last time he was here and that time. Um, and that kind of speed, that kind of bold thinking, it's hard to imagine here in the U.S. And I think at least those of us who'd like a little more dynamism pine for that. I think I'm a little skeptical that what works over there is going to work here. Um, and I'm also skeptical that we would want to go nearly as far as all that. I mean, I'm talking here about a calibration problem. I'm not talking about let's just you know, forget about trying to hear what the public cares about. We're just going to decide it from on high. I don't think that would be healthy in the long run. Um, but look, I think this is a time for us all to take a step back and think hard about like, what can we change in order to make this better? Because it's not working right now. Um, I think to bring it back to China, I think one of the risks that keeps me up at night is if you make government unable to satisfy the aspirations of the public, um, you're going to get folk like Trump who say, I alone can fix it, who come in and say, I can break through all the constraints. I can be the person who can make this government work for you. And that's the accumulation of highly uncabined discretion in the hands of a single person in a way that I think is anathema to what we're hoping to avoid when we federal government. In other words, the constraints can be so tight that you end up creating the very kind of unbounded executive power that you are trying to avoid.
But that's sort of a scenario where there's unhappiness with the American system and what's going on. When you look at sort of maybe to push back on that a little bit, I mean, when you look at sort of American growth, economic growth, the last 30, 40 years, you compare it to other large countries. It's far from obvious they're doing something better than us, right? Because the U.S. has had
That's
faster
right.
growth generally than Europe. So is part of the issue maybe that just the U.S. is we're doing fine. I mean, maybe somehow it's beyond us, but somehow this whole thing of APA procedure just somehow works, and the private sector just works around this enfeebled government, which can't screw things up.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of responses. One is I think some of our problems are being papered over. I think there are long-term failures to invest. I mean, here in Michigan, the governor ran and won on a platform of fix the damn roads. I mean, literally, roads are crumbling at a greater extent in Michigan than they have been. And like you can kind of patch them up, you can get by, But over time, that's going to put a serious crimp in your ability to stay at the leading edge of economic development. I have big fears about other kinds of infrastructure and workforce concerns over the long term. So some of our failure, housing is a good example, right? Like you can refuse to build for 20, 30, 40 years and it's not a big deal until all of a sudden it is. And I do think there are a bunch of problems kind of like that festering under the surface. I don't think Europe is in great shape. And I think to some extent, some of the procedural finickiness that I see in the American system is duplicated elsewhere. It might be partly a response to affluence and people being pretty satisfied with the status quo and creating all sorts of rules that entrench that status quo, and not just here, but elsewhere. The last thing I'll say is just, okay, you're right. We're muddling through and it's probably going to be okay. And I don't have any reason to, I don't doubt you. I agree with you. I think that's true. We could be so much more. And I do think government has a constructive role to play in making us so much more.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you. So I asked about China. There's a this Canadian province. Was it British Columbia? It was Ontario. I forget which province. Do you know about this? They did a massive deregulation thing where they had a rule where you have to get rid of 2 for every 1 you put in, sort of like the Trump administration thing, but it was actually more stringent. Have you read about this?
I haven't looked at it. I'm familiar with the Trump administration effort, but not the
Yeah.
Okay. The effort of the Canadian province.
Okay, I won't ask. I won't ask you to comment. But the larger, the larger question, the larger point is, who really is doing this well? I mean, China. I mean, they're a dictatorship. They're still a middle income country, so they're hungry. They want to catch up to the rest of the world. We and Europe, the Europeans, are sort of we're affluent, so maybe this is a natural consequence of affluence. Maybe barring this one Canadian province that I can't remember which one it was that might have actually figured this out. But is there somebody who has, is there some country you look to and say, they're doing this right? They've got administrative law down, and we should aspire to be something closer to them.
I'm not a comparativist, so I'm not sure I've got a great answer for you. We do have good cross-cultural, cross-country comparisons of things like how much does it cost to build a mile of subway, right? Now, that's not just a function of the law. There are a lot of other factors that go into it. And I think as we're learning more, we're learning that it is a multiplicity of factors. But we also know that we spend an order of magnitude more per mile of line here in the US. And the law certainly has a role to play there. So, if I was going to look to try to see the problems that we've got here and to try to fix some of them, I would look to places like Spain, which have extremely low cost per mile, and say, well, what are they doing right that we aren't? And it may be domain specific, right? It may be that there are certain kinds of rules and certain kinds of domains that make it easier for them to build subways, but make it much harder for them to do, fill in the blank. And we have some advantages along some margins and some disadvantages along others. And I don't think we are going to find a, let's just do everything like they do it, a kind of answer out there. I think what we need to do is start taking, what I'm hoping that my paper accomplishes is for people to stop being so credulous about the claimed benefits of any kind of government, rule that says we want government to do X, and so we'll pass a law or we'll adopt a new procedure, and to ask simply and carefully, like, are the benefits of this rule going to exceed its costs? Are we actually going to achieve the goals that we set here? Are we going to make it much harder for the agency to do its job? And that kind of reflexive checking of enthusiasm for the latest procedural fad or whatever, I think over time and along a bunch of different margins could do a lot of good.
What do you think about sort of, you talked about differences between countries. What about differences between states? Most states, I assume, don't have anything equivalent to the APA. You've worked in Michigan. Are there just any thoughts on what states are doing well, what they're not doing well, or comparisons?
Yeah, most states do have versions of the APA. Many states have versions that are even more stringent. And you can see those creating challenges for state agencies in their daily operations all the time. In particular, you have even more stringent judicial review at the state and local level than you often do at the federal level. So I don't think there is any state that's doing it perfectly, but you have to remember they're all looking to the federal government for a certain kind of guidance. So there's a lot of learning that happens there. One place where I do think you've seen kind of counterintuitively some real progress here has been, Texas has had an edge on renewable energy for many, many years because it is separated from the rest of the national electrical grid, had made some large investments early on, and is, I think, all else equal, more impatient with some of the procedural, some of the efforts to prevent private investment. And as a result, they've got a ton more renewable power than virtually, I think, any state. And they're hopefully that trend line will continue, although the politics of renewables is such that it's hard to know for sure.
Yeah, this reminds me of Ezra Klein talking. He talked about. I think he said the Republican states were relatively better on housing for for reasons. Sometimes that's to progressive ends. I mean, progressives often care about poor people and racial minorities and people who are hurt by the high cost of housing. So yeah, seems like another sort of paradox here with Texas is leading the country in renewable energy. I'm interested, Nick. I've enjoyed this discussion. I'm interested in this synthesis. I think there's intellectual sort of synergy here by a lot of smart people who sort of seem like political opponents most of the time. So I'm interested in that. I've enjoyed talking to you. I'm a little bit of a when I was in law school, administrative procedure was actually like one of my favorite courses, and I don't know how much of my audience actually cares about the administrative. There's like all this talk. Oh, the administrative state. It's almost like a talking point on the right. I don't know how many people care about administrative procedures or thinking carefully about it. But yeah, this was fun. Do you have recommendations as far as people who want to know more about administrative law, want to know about more about the regulatory state, sort of what it does well, what it doesn't? What's your sort of go-to as far as people becoming informed?
Yeah, I think for popular books, and I mentioned this on the Klein podcast, Michael Lewis has a book called The Fifth Risk, which looks at the Trump administration taking over from the Obama administration and to, I think, quite effectively explore what a bunch of agencies that you probably don't know anything about do. So, what does the Department of Energy do exactly, and why should we care? And Lewis makes a really careful, thoughtful case for government does a whole lot more than you think, and what it does really matters. And the folk there are working overtime to try to figure out how to how to improve the world, and shouldn't be maligned thoughtlessly by folk who don't even have the dimmest appreciation of what it is they do. And I think that is a useful corrective, a way of thinking. Okay, maybe this is bigger and more complicated and necessary than I thought it was, and maybe I ought to be thinking hard about how we can make it more nimble, more effective, focus its efforts on the things it does well, and refocus it away from the things it does poorly. I think that feels like the synthesis that I'd like to go for, and I think that's where I would direct popular listeners.
Okay, so Michael Lewis's book. Okay. What do you do? Are you thinking about going back into government service, or are you staying in academia, or sort of what's next for you?
So I'm an academic by background. I'll stay here for the time being, at least. Government service was such an honor and so much fun, but it is so taxing, and I definitely need to take a big step back from it. And if in the future I have another opportunity to serve, I'd definitely be open to it. But I have no present plans.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us, and yeah, thanks a lot. Take care.